So without further ado, we'll hand over presenter to Ben Biddulph. And this morning we're talking about frost, and it's weed smart, and so we've got a weed angle to it. And that, I guess, there are issues with frost and weeds in terms of time of sowing, and there's also issues where we have slightly conflicting messages between frost messages and weed management messages for herbicide-resistant weeds. And we're going to really try and dig into a bit of that during this webinar. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Ben, and let you go. And as I said, we'll pause for questions as we go. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so I mean, basically, what I want to do a quick run through today is have a look at, the key drivers of frost and our production system's response to frost. So I'm going to focus on the Western region today because 2016 wasn't a very productive year for a lot of growers in WA because of the impact of frost in our production system. And I'll focus on a few different things, but what I really want to focus on is, and Garren will finish off some of this session later on, is looking at the key drivers, what we're doing right and what we probably need to tweak it and do a bit better. So without further ado, I'll get straight into it. So essentially, sorry, just having trouble getting my slide to change.
Sometimes you just need to click on the actual slide itself, Ben, and then it sort of wakes it up.
Yep.
And then do your arrow. Yep.
There we go. Thanks, mate. So, I guess, we need to be aware that frost is, is a four-letter word, and a lot of those four-letter words are normally resumed to sheep yards, but frost has a very emotive impact on our production system, and particularly after we've come off a year like 2016, where we did have a significant amount of frost damage throughout our central production zone. A lot of people are double questioning what they've done based on what they did last year. And really what I want to discuss today is last year, was an exceptional year in terms of frost. And I will go through that because it is worth reliving some of that pain. But, by and large, what we did last year in terms of a production system, we didn't get much wrong. What I really want to focus on today is what we did do wrong, and what are the tools that we do have available, and how can we make sure that those tools are really polished as we go into the 2017 season. But the key take-home message from today really is we can't let the frost of 2016 burn us in 2017. There are some things we can need to tweak. We need to manage a bit better, and that's basically the focus of Garren and my talks today. Doing it again. All right, so this is basically just a quick plot of the minimum temperature over, so basically last year we had the coldest spring across the southwest of WA. So if you draw a line from Biddulph to Esperance, we had the coldest minimum temperatures, and these are the minimum temperature anomalies from the average minimum temperature for the southwest. And we haven't had a year as cold as 2016 until we go back in the records to about 1969. It was also not only was it the coldest average minimum temperature throughout that September period, but we also set a lot of records in terms of the actual minimum temperatures received. These are quick some. Yes, Newbs?
Oh, you're okay, mate. I think it might be because you're using the laser, and we can see your arrow. So if you want to stick with your arrow, that's fine.
Okay, I'll stick with the arrow. So these are basically the frost events in August 2016 on the left here versus the average frost events we have in our production system throughout the main growing season. And you can see last year was, we had a large parts of the central wheat belt where we had more than 8 to 10 days of frost in August. Normally, there's only those areas are relatively small, but last year, in compared to normal, August was definitely a lot more frosty than last year. And if we go through to September, we can see that trend continued through September, and this is where a lot of the frost damage happened. We had, in our central production zone, we also had large areas where we had more than 8 to 10 days of frost damage, or frost, and most of those frosts were causing damage, compared to what we have normally, where we normally only have 3 or 4 days in that central production zone with frost. The other key point to look for in the 2016 data is that a lot of that frost damage also extends further north into the northern production zone. and also further south into the more southern production zones, further than it normally does. So last year, it was particularly devastating for frost, but we've got to make sure that we don't let, that really severe year. People have said that the 98 frost was a 1 in a 100-year event, and then they said the same thing about the 2008 frost, and then, we're going to remember the 2016 frost as we go forward. But, we have to be careful that we can't release a farm for these really severe events. We need to make sure we're maximising our production in the normal years, and, hopefully our farm equity and our profitability will help manage out these really bad years like we have experienced in 2016. What really drove that frost last year is this just consistent weather pattern where we had weak cold fronts going through. Behind those weak cold fronts, we had the southwesterly flow, which brought up a lot of cool air. And if we look across this graph here, we had a lot of that cold air was actually coming from a long way south. So I've been working with James Risby in sowing, and he's been tracking the cold air particles during frost events. And basically you can see here, a lot of the cold air which descended across cold and dry air, which descended across our landscape prior to those frosts in September, came from the really low latitude, so up around the top end of Antarctica and the bottom of South America. So those cold air is very clear, very stable and very dry, and that's basically what came in and descended over our landscape behind that front. Then obviously we had this big blocking high moving in late in the afternoon and then sent it over the landscape. Now that part of this project which James is working on is actually looking at whether we can better predict with climate change what's driving these changes in our production system, and whether we can better predict years or seasons when this is going to happen. Now at the moment they haven't really been able to find a consistent pattern or a consistent way to actually predict that. They've got some clues, but at the moment the current message that's coming out of there is that the frost that we're experiencing in the 2000s are likely to continue at least until 2030 with climate change. So the severity of the frost that we've experienced in the last few years is not likely to completely disappear as we go further forward. It may after 2030 as the climate warms further, but we're certainly going to be in for more frost in the short term. So it's just going to be one of those things we have to start to manage and better manage as we go forward. So, frost is a 4-letter word, putting it bluntly. It's buggered. There's not much we can do about it, but there are some things that we need to manage. Last year was a really severe year. We need to make sure that we don't focus too much on that and just revisit the basic principles of how we manage frost in our production system going forward, and maybe you need to retweak how we're doing that. So I've been working on frost for the last 8 years, and prior to that I hadn't worked a lot on frost. My family farm is actually down on the south coast. We've only been frosted there once in once in 30 years since we've been farming here, and that was in the 2005 frost, and that was when we first started sowing wild catch and wheat, and we did all the things wrong. We sowed it on the 5th of May down on the river flat country, and it was actually got frosted on my mum's birthday on September the 13th. And the main reason that got frosted was 2005 was another really bad frost year for that region. And we sowed wild catch in the most vulnerable part of the landscape, the very early wheat, and it got frosted. Dad rang me up again early May this year. He was about to sow his maize in the same paddock, and he goes, "Ben, should I sow my maize in the same paddock?" And it's not much longer than wild catch them. And the quick answer was, yeah, well, you've still got cows to feed. If it gets frosted, you can cut it for hay. But at the end of the day, he's only been frosted 1 in 30 years. So it wasn't really a big risk for him to make that decision to go forward. Now, obviously, as we come into the central production zone, particularly in Western Australia, that risk changes, and the salvage options also change. So we have been working with GRDC on this for the last 3 years with the development of the GRDC National Frost Initiative. And through that, we've actually been working and updating a lot of the GRDC, or a lot of the frost management recommendations. So one of the key sources that we've got put out at the moment is the GRDC Frost Tips and Tactics, which goes through, pre-season, in-season and post-season frost management techniques. And a lot of this is about, making sure that, the tools in your toolbox are nice and shiny. So we can go through this and you can step through this. I'm not going to do it today because it'll take, a couple of hours, but growers, if want to fine-tune what they've done and how they've managed and want to double-check that what they're doing is right. Now, this is a good tool or a good resource just to go and download. You can download it by Googling GRDC Frost Tips and Tactics, and it'll come up #1. And just have a good look through it and, make sure that what you're doing is aligning with that, and the risks that you're taking with your business. And the main talk about what I want to focus on today is around looking at seeding time. And, you know, this old adage that finishing seeding first doesn't necessarily mean that we're winning. And, you know, a lot of this comes back to how varieties develop. Now, you might wonder why I put up a photo of a Toyota Land Cruiser, the old reliable cruiser, not the fastest car on the planet, but can certainly handle the rough terrain and the rough roads and the bumps along the way, versus, you know, a nice shiny new Merc. I've seen a few of these travelling around the wheat belt in the last couple of years, the last couple of weeks. So obviously not everyone got completely burnt by frost last year. But, you know, wheat varieties also perform similar. There's different varieties which perform similar to the two cars. So there's, you know, there's the longer season varieties which are slower to develop, more reliable and are better able to handle bumps along the way. And there's quicker, shorter season varieties which are, you know, good when there's a good run and a good sprint to the finish, like the Merc, and they'll certainly get faster top speeds and get you there quicker. But, you know, it just depends on how you want to manage your system, on whether you choose a cruiser or a Merc when you do your variety selection. Yeah, and that also depends a lot on, you know, how many bumps you're anticipating on the way. So if you've got a family and, you know, you're packing up your wife and kids to do a 500k trip, which a lot of you do in the wheat belt, sometimes you'll have 300k's of gravel and 100k's of bitumen at the end. Then, you know, you'd certainly be looking at a cruiser to try and match that road. But if you're doing something the other way around, so if you're in a different part of the wheat belt where you've got good roads, and, you know, you've got good bitumen all the way, then, you know, definitely the Merc might be the quicker way to get you there and safer way to get you there on your destination. And wheat varieties are a bit the same, and that's basically what the focus of my talk will be on now. One thing we have to be aware of when we look at variety performance information from MBT is the range of sowing dates which it's been collected from. So this is basically on the left here. These are the actual number of trials, or the trial across 2012 to 2016, when the actual MBT trials have been sown. So you can see in the old MBT program from 2012 was also a bit of a late break. A lot of the MBT program didn't get sown until mid-May to early June. But the last few years, Calyx and Living Farm have been doing a pretty good job. Most of their trials have been sown around the 15th of May. If we come across here, we can see that, you know, this is just the distribution of that MBT data set for the last 5 years. We can see that, you know, most of the trials, you know, the trial mean is around the 15th of May in terms of sowing date, but there's still a large proportion sown in the back end of the season. The other issue we do have with MBT is because it's around optimising yield potential and assessing the yield potential of different varieties. It is doing that for the 15th of May, but we also, a lot of the industry are well aware that if a trial is frosted severely, it doesn't get included in the MBT analysis. So a lot of these earlier times of sowing, which do get frosted, and last year was a classic example where we've lost about 18 to 20 of the MBT out of the WA data set because of severe frost damage. You know, that information in terms of how it affects variety performance and the long-term variety mean doesn't end up in the MBT analysis. So the other component, the other complexity to this story is we're always familiar with this sowing date by grain yield interaction. You know, we know a lot that, you know, as we say later, there's a large yield penalty, as we say later, from the optimal sowing date of around mid-May for a range of varieties. And, you know, you can plot your different varieties. This is Septa, you know, and they're our trials at the moment. You know, it's topping our trials in that late May to early June planting window. Maker's a bit behind it, and Yippie's up there. And Magenta's is competitive as well in that sowing window, but the winter wheats put out by Weiler are not very competitive as well. Not very competitive when you go into that late May window compared to the mid-season and long-season wheat. I guess the old adage is, you know, what happens in this planting window up here, and the reality is that most of our production system is not sown around this 17th of May to late May. A lot of our growers across WA are now sowing their wheat at least 1 to 2 weeks earlier than that. So, you know, the last couple of years, the trial mean, the state industry average sowing date for wheat is around the first week of May. So, you know, does this data, which we're collecting from back here, still hold true as we go further forward? So we've been running trials over the last couple of years just to try and look at that. And we've basically been focusing these in really frost-prone parts of the landscape because, you know, I want to look at the impact of frost on those. But there are some key messages for most of our production systems. So we've been throwing around 100 odd wheat varieties from the 15th of April to the 22nd of June in the most frost-prone place we can find. All our trials are irrigated so that the sowing date is the actual germination date. even though in 2015 we probably could have got away without much irrigation, it certainly helps to make sure everything's uniform and well established. And these are just some of the quick plots of the grain yield on the left-hand side against the flowering date along the bottom here. And so these are our first early times of sowing on the 15th of April and on the 22nd of April. So the 15th is in blue and the 22nd is in the red. And you can see from that early sowing date, particularly in 2015, our material was flowering from late June through July into early August for those early sowing dates, and the yields weren't overly impressive, around 2 tonnes per hectare. The material that was sown at that time but flowering later, around the 5th of, in that early September window, was managing to achieve around 3 tonne yield. As we go later, in terms of our sowing date, so this is the 29th of April, the 8th of May, we can start to see, the grain yields picking up through to the 15th and 23rd of May, and then as we go into June, we get that downward slope in grain yield at the back end of the season when we're running into heat and water stress. Now, these are basically the frost events across that site. So we had around 40 frost events at that site for that year, and these are the actual minimum canopy air temperatures, so when the actual frost events occurred. And also for reference, I've put on the heat events at that site, so when the temperatures got above 30 degrees, and that's been scaled back to come around 3, so the 33.4 here is actually it got to 34 on that early day in October. But the clear thing to see is that our optimal yield was still happening despite all of these frosts in that mid-September flowering window for that year. So we could have sown early last year in 2015 with our mid-season wheats, but they would have flowered really early and got hit by a lot of frost, and that's what you see here. Not only did some of them got through the flowering frost, so they never got flowering frosted here, but then they still had this whole window of grain field to get through where there was still a lot more severe frost. So when we talk about optimising sowing time to minimise frost risk and heat risk, a lot of it's around that cumulative damage. So we have to stop thinking about frost as, we dodged the bullet at flowering. Frost damage is cumulative, and there's a wide window of damage from early flowering all the way through to mid-grain fill. And we've basically got and our optimal yields quite often come, even though we can flower during that optimal window, it also relies on us actually being able to get through that grain fill period with minimal frost damage as well. And there's just a nice sigmoidal yield response that we can plot across there. So how do different varieties respond to that? And, if we come back to that, variety class type of thing, this is the grain yield against flowering date. And we can see the frost events again plotted on top here. And we've picked a range of varieties to represent different maturity classes. So I've got Axe here, which is the short season variety. It's mainly, phenology is mainly controlled by thermal time. So essentially as it's warmer, it will grow faster. Mace, which has got a slight vernalisation requirement compared to Axe, a little bit longer BVP or basic vegetative period, so it needs a little bit of cold before it will flower. Magenta, which has got a slightly longer thermal time, slightly longer BVP and a bit more vernalisation requirement than Mace, because it takes a little bit longer. A Yitpi type, which is a longer season wheat, which has a photoperiod response, and most of our photoperiod responsive varieties of Yitpi and Cutlass work quite well in most of our production system, and then a winter wheat. And you can see here, we get the classic yield response of Yitpi type or a photoperiod responsive type versus a short season wheat versus a winter wheat. Now the real question is, okay, so how do we actually manage this in our production system? How do we use this information from a time of sowing perspective? Well, I guess the clear thing is, as we sow earlier, our grain yields don't keep going up for all of these varieties. Some of them it does, some of them it drops down pretty quickly, and that's what we saw in this graph here. And as we go on, if we look at this data versus sowing date by grain yield, we can see that the quick season varieties pretty much never really achieve good yields until you sow them in late June, mid to late June. They're not competitive, whereas our longer season wheats, our Yitpi and Magenta, are really competitive compared to the Mace type, so the mid-season type, in that late April to early May sowing. So in this period, the lines don't keep going up for all the varieties. Some of the varieties it does, and then it drops down again. Other varieties it keeps going up, and it's not. For example, with your winter types, it's really here. So when we look at this from a production system point of view, we basically want to be trying to manage our variety choice and sowing date to make sure we're trying to tick the top of this line all the way through here. to maximise our production, we've got to make sure we're at the top of this line for our sowing date and our variety choice. Now, the challenge we have is that a lot of our agronomic information on terms of variety performance comes from this back end of the window. So yes, if we're looking at mid to late May, the maize types are really competitive and out yield the longer season wheat. But as we go into this early May to late April window, the longer season magentas and yippies and cutlasses, those varieties start to perform. And then as we go into really early sowings, early for wheat, in terms of early April to mid-April, that's when the winter wheats shine, and that's when they actually are competitive. Now, I guess part of the problem we have as an industry is that we're always quite worried about the 100 to 200 kilogram yield loss at the back end of the season in terms of variety selection, without really being fully aware of the large, this is a 2-tonne yield difference down here, or 1.5 to 2 tonne yield difference, and that's the opportunity. That's where the opportunity is in our system as we're going forward, to try and better manage what we do at this front end of the program.
So can I interject? If I just go back to that one perhaps, and I might ask Garren to comment here as well, Garren. So essentially we're seeing a lot of farmers move to early sowing. It's a sort of a hard tide to hold back the early sowing movement. So from what I can gather is what you are suggesting, and maybe you're getting to it now, sorry if I've cut you off early, is that we should have a range of varieties on hand, and maybe we keep sowing early, but we make sure we've got the long season variety in the silo to make use of those early sowing opportunities. Is that the right message?
Yeah, definitely. So, there's a huge opportunity. This is where our opportunity is in terms of variety choice. We can really make a big difference in terms of our productivity at this end of the window. At this end of the window, when we're in our late May sowing window for wheat, there's bugger all difference between the varieties. There is, but, you're splitting hairs. It's whether it's kilograms better yielding. Whereas at the front end of our program, it's whether it's a tonne better yielding. So, in terms of how you want to manage that, if you want to push for opportunity, the opportunity is at the front end of the window.
Righto. And so, Garren, can I ask you to comment there? What are you seeing growers do?
Exactly right. Growers are making their variety decision based on data generated in the second half of May, and then they're using that data to make variety decisions for the second half of April and early May. And they're just giving up. In Europe, where they regularly grow 10 and 12 tonne crops, they don't do that by growing short season varieties. They select varieties that utilise the full season length to set up a yield potential and achieve a very high yield. So when we grow these short season varieties and plant them early, they're bolting, poking their head out early and rushing through. And they'll achieve a decent yield, but they could be achieving a better yield. And in the presence of frost, when they're flowering early, in a frost-prone landscape, the question becomes not will it get frosted, but how badly will it get frosted? Because if you've got your head out in August, there will be frost events that will affect it. If you've got your head out in September, there's a chance you'll sneak through and get minimal or may avoid frost completely. So they're they're using the wrong tool for the job and really amplifying their frost risk.
Excellent. Thanks, Garren. And yeah, and a little bit more to that, probably Ben first, is some of the concerns I've heard from growers is, say we start early sowing with a longer season magenta, and then we get a bit further into sowing, and then we switch to mace. We could end up with all of our wheat flowering at about the same time, and then we're concerned that it's all exposed to frost at the same time. But am I right in your sort of saying that message is a bit old, and it was more about the cumulative frosts rather than just that one frost at flowering?
Yeah, particularly. And, if we have a look at this plot here, we can see when we talk about managing our flowering risk and optimising that across the production window, it is this window. We need to spread our flowering across this window to try and optimise that. We don't need to spread it across this window. So if we're flowering early, we're just on more risk for no real reward. Whereas if we're flowering in this window, yes, we're still going to get hit. And you can see here, there's not a lot of difference between these varieties in terms of when they flowered, but there's still a response in terms of how they produce grain yield and how they manage to their final end result, despite frost, despite getting whacked and losing, 20 to 30% grain yield due to those frosts.
And Peter, just to add on to there, some of my clients that are in, have high frost risk country, they'll sow their long season early, then they'll sow their short season varieties high in the landscape, and then they'll move to their lower in the landscape paddocks, and they'll show their finish on their long season again. So what they end up getting is a very big spread, because their last crop in is their longer season variety on a moisture gaining, low lying soil type that's high frost risk, and that just pushes it, really spreads out that window.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, I'm aware that Ben's got to leave in a moment, so I'll let you finish off, Ben, and everyone listening in out there, make sure you get any questions of Ben in pretty soon, because Ben's going to head off in a couple of minutes, but he'll be able to listen in for a while and perhaps answer a couple of questions. So I'll let you finish off, Ben, and then, make sure you type your questions into the questions box, everyone.
Yeah, so I guess another main point is that varieties with the same maturity class in a high frost-prone environment give you the same yield response, grain yield response at the time of sowing. So, it doesn't really matter what short season variety you give, they give you that same grain yield response. Most of the mid-season varieties give you that same yield response. The long season varieties give you that same yield response of being adapted to that early May sowing window. And most of your winters, it doesn't actually matter what winter variety it is, perform really well in that late April or that early mid-April to early May window. Now, to answer your question, to bring it back to the starting point, that, these varieties really are the Mercedes-Benz of the Merc of the wheat production industry. They are good for late sowing, and they are good when you've got a clear run to the finish with a nice smooth road with no bumps on the road like frost. Whereas, if we're looking for those early planting opportunities where you've got a long way to go to get to the end, where you've got, there's going to be hiccups along the way, then you're going to need a much more stable, much more robust platform to get you there safely. And, the longs and the winters, they are the cruisers of the wheat production system. And, just to go back and drive that message home, these are just some gross incomes for the Brookton site in 2015 of just opportunistically picking off the top of that curve. So, sowing your winters early, shifting into your longs, and then finishing up with your mid-season wheat. We averaged around $195 a hectare, compared if we just sown May throughout that whole one window. And if we do that dry sowing thing and we do have a late break, so if we sow our winters dry in late April or early April and they don't actually come up to mid to late May, are we actually any worse off than just, than we would have been of sowing May? We are a little bit worse off, but, it's a bit of a trade-off. There was a lot of opportunity which we could have picked up. We didn't get it. But, there's not a big yield loss there or a big gross income loss in that either. I'll just skip through the next couple of slides. We did the same thing again last year, 2016, obviously a much more severe frost season, and essentially we found the same thing. And I'll quickly flick through these slides, the same thing. Early sowing of the mid-season wheats got really badly frosted. We had an optimal peak here where we actually got through. We got achieved, this is the most frost-prone part of the landscape in a really high frost year. We're still getting yields of, of around plus side of 4 tonnes with matching variety and time of sowing. Same sort of thing here. A lot of people will be interested to see how septic goes compared to maize. Yes, it is higher yielding than maize at the back end of the window, but it does drop off really sharply as we go into that late April to early May window. That's when, your magenta, your yippy and your cutlass types are dominating the system, and the winters are still quite competitive. They're the real only option we've got for those those mid-April to early April sowing planting windows. Same thing, there was a much bigger yield opportunity cost of sowing one variety last year, around $400 a hectare at that site, which is what you'd expect with a higher yield potential last year, and a lot of frost damage in our early sown spring wheat or mid-season wheats in those sites. As we go along, what if last year hadn't turned out to be such a good break? Would we have been worse off? We actually would have been better off last year sowing our winters, even though when they came up late because of the season that we had. So, the summary really for this work, particularly for the central production zones, that, the winter wheats are suited to that April sowing. They do well in late April to early May. Their large difference is yield potential compared to the April sown mid. And the longs are really suited, the yippy, the cutlass, the magenta types are suited to that early May to mid-May planting. There's the cruisers of the wheat production system, and that's what we need to use in that time of the window. And, you know, the mids have their place, but it's in that mid-May planting, basically. And the shorts, well, I don't know whether there's a real big fit for those anymore, but a lot of those have important agronomic traits that people are using. So I guess, Worley, what's new in the toolbox for 2017? I mean, there's nothing new. We just got to make sure that the tools in there are polished and we're using them as best we can. We've got to make sure the frost from 2016 don't burn us in 2017. If we're going to sow early, we've got to sow a long season variety, particularly wheat. If we sow earlier, we're going to sow an even longer one, or just don't sow wheat at all. There are other options, other crop types, which have a better fit for that late April, early May window if you don't have a winter wheat. And Garren will probably cover off on a little bit of stubble is okay. Thank you. And I'm happy to speak about
Ben. Yeah, well, we don't have any questions coming in, so if you do have a question, type it in right now before Ben leaves us. So thank you, Ben. I mean, we have been through this era in WA, particularly where we've had a very large part of our area sown to mace, and you've got a pretty strong message there that we need to change those ways. It's obviously something that takes a little time to change because people have to bulk up seed and get it on hand, but are you hearing from growers that they are thinking along those lines already?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly always been a lot of interest in the newer long season varieties as they've come through. I guess, you know, the reality is that, you know, you may not be able to get enough, you know, seed of cutlass to actually dominate your program, but there's nothing wrong with yippee still. But there's still other varieties, some of the older varieties. You know, you don't have to have the latest 200 series Land Cruiser. The 100 series Land Cruiser is still going to get you there at the end of the day. You know, some of the older germplasm, which has that fit for that early May sowing window, is still competitive compared to what the other options are.
I tell you what I find interesting is we went through the early 2000s where rainfall was extremely variable and getting rain in May extremely difficult, and as a result we were looking for shorter season wheats. That was what everyone was talking about. We want a wheat we can sow at the end of May, beginning of June, because we're not getting rain till then. And now it seems that system has moved a lot. We are getting summer rain, we're storing that moisture, and then we're getting a chance to sow in April, and people are going for it. And so we still have variable rainfall, and May is still hard, but we are getting we've seen a big shift, haven't we, into a farming system of early sowing to take advantage of those April rains. So what you're saying fits into that nicely.
Yeah, I mean, we have a set of wheat varieties which are good for that mid-May to late May planting window. That's where they fit. If we want to sow earlier, we have to look for other germplasm. And, you know, we've also had a big switch in our management, like you've indicated. You know, we are sowing our wheat in all of our cropping program a lot earlier to try and manage that risk of not getting a planting rain later or enough water later to get it up and going. And, you know, that's fine for those environments. In the last couple of years, things have changed, and this year's looking like that it's going to be similar to last year at the moment. So we need to keep that in mind, that we need to plan for that, and we need different tools for those seasons.
Garren here. Yeah. If I could just add on to that, what I feel is we need to have more flexibility in our farming system and our varieties we keep. And I think it's one of the downside of adoption of really good agronomy planning. When I work out with my clients how much of each variety we need to keep, you know, it might be 75 tonne of mace and 35 tonne of yippee. That's what they keep. But then we get delivered a different season than the average, which obviously we get every year, and we lose that flexibility. Whereas when farmers weren't as good at planning, they'd keep lots of every season and they just adjust it on the run. And I think we need to plan more flexibility into our system rather than having a fixed plan that we can't adjust on the go. So if we get an early break, we've got to take it, because you may not have good moisture at the right time, but you need to have the right tools for the job. And that's really the key message is sow early by all means, but with the right tool.
Righto, thanks Garren, and thanks Ben. Ben's got to hit the road, I think, so thank you very much for your time, Ben, and if a question does come in, perhaps you might stay in touch for a few minutes, but otherwise we'll hand over to Garren. Garren's taking control now, and Garren, I remember, or might even be close to 15 years ago, you being quite a mouthpiece for the Frost initiative. You were in the middle of it down there where you were working, and back then there was very little research, and you're involved, and you're still working in that area, and you've just come through obviously the biggest frost year on record. So you've had a long history in it. Am I right that it was nearly 15 years ago, Garren?
Yeah, 1998 was my first exposure to really bad frost, and we started our GRDC research project in 2002, looking at agronomic management options. Effectively, we were myth-busting, testing a whole lot of theories and strategies, practical agronomy, things that growers that we could test that would prove or disprove different theories people had on frost. So that really got us started and gave growers some options, and now we see the National Frost Initiative, which is great to see some proper hardcore science applied to the problem rather than just broad-scale agronomic solutions. So in my area, I estimate that 30% of my clients lose 40% of their potential every second year. So it's a major issue. Probably another way is every one of my clients, on average, loses 20% every year. And the other side of that is, that's just the loss from frost. There's also the lost opportunity from frost. So strategies that we adopt to minimise our frost risk don't always maximise yield in a frost-free year. So there's trade-offs that we know we're giving our potential to try and minimise our frost risk.
Yeah. All right, well, we've robbed you a little bit of your time. We've got 20 minutes to go, Garren, so I'll let you hook into it.
I'll jump straight into it. So firstly, stubble. It's now, we've been saying it for a while, but it's conclusively measured in numerous trials over numerous years that retaining a heavy stubble burden limits the ability of heat to radiate out of the soil and ends up at a colder air temperature at head height. So really heavy stubble loads, such as this one, a lot of people would consider a little bit on the heavy side for the amount of stubble. And I'm told that this amount of stubble is much more popular, and certainly from a frost point of view, I'm sure he gets a few more warm, cosy nights than the other guy.
We have a few ladies listening in, Garren. You are the man. You've just made it.
So this is just a schematic diagram, and it may be useful for people to have a look later on, but effectively the heavy retained stubble acts as an insulator. You get a little less heat entering the soil, but probably the key thing is you get less heat radiating out at night. So the thermal heat mass in the soil is trapped in, and you get less heat radiating out at night, which results in, at any given temperature event, colder temperatures around head height. So I'll just quickly run through one trial, but there's, we can present 10 or 15 trials that show similar results. What we're commonly seeing is that half a degree warmer, half to 1 degree, depending on where it is and what frost it is. And in a lot of cases, that depends on how bad the frost is, whether it's enough to make a difference. So this trial was in York last year, full stubble removal, 0, 1 tonne, 2 tonne, 4 tonnes per hectare. And this chart shows minimum temperature over a number of frost events. So the 0 is the blue line. So at any given frost event, you can see where the stubble is completely removed, it's warmer at head height, versus where we've got 4 tonne of stubble per hectare, the temperatures are colder. When you add that up over a number of frost events, you can see that it starts to accumulate, and again, the 4 tonne is a time below temperature threshold. The 4 tonne per hectare is accumulating numerous or a lot more hours over time below a critical temperature. When we took it through to yield, this is Rebecca Jenkinson's trial, badly frosted site, 800 kilos per hectare, 820 kilos, returning $195 with full burn, right up to where the 4 tonne per hectare of stubble was retained. Yield was down to 230 kilos. So you can really show that that stubble retention is adding to frost risk over numerous events. It's not just all about the one event, but accumulated damage over each time. When doesn't it work? This is the trial site of mine at Corrigan last year. It was looking really good. We did some quick ratings for a field day. There was some good early trends. What happened though is we went on and got another 4 or 5 frost events after this, and the trial was completely frosted. So where we removed it, it went under 200 kilos. where we retained and had short stubble, we're looking at now very low yields. So when you have bad frost events, such as a -4 or numerous very cold events, the thermal advantage of removing stubble is completely overwashed by the cold event. So removing stubble is great. If you're on the shoulder, what we tend to find with frost is there's kind of a tipping point between not freezing and freezing. And so let's say that tipping point might be -1.5 for a particular site. If you're -1.5 or -2, that half a degree difference could be very valuable in not versus frosted versus not frosted. Whereas when you're at -4, that extra half a degree, so maybe being only 3.5 degrees minus rather than 4, is not enough to make a difference. Here's some data from the early 2000s. The blue line is where retained or added stubble. The green line is bare, and you can see the soil temperature, subsoil, is warmer with retained stubble, but as soon as we hit the surface, it's colder on the surface, colder in the canopy, and about half a degree colder at head height. That just shows you some of the thermal dynamics that are going on. So to finish it, the frost team have developed a bit of a rule of thumb for growers, and that is you need to match your stubble load to your grain yield. So if you're let's say at Merredin and you're targeting 1.5 tonne per hectare, you only want to retain 1.5 tonne of stubble from the previous year. If you're in a 4 tonne environment, we believe that the bigger, bulkier crop can handle a higher stubble load. So in a higher yielding environment, reducing your stubble burden down to around that 4 tonne per hectare is adequate. We have a really high yielding, high bulk crop. We find that the impact of stubble is actually reduced because the crop canopy takes over and the extra cover from the stubble isn't as great. But there's a real message for the low rainfall areas. Last year, while they didn't harvest a massive crop, they grew very big crops with a lot of stubble. So if they retain all of that stubble leading into seeding, they're actually going to be well and truly over this threshold. So in frost-prone areas that were smashed with frost last year, and they may have grown a 4 tonne potential crop because the year was very good, but they may have only harvested 1.8, they're still potentially looking at 6 to 8 tonne of stubble on the ground that could really ramp up their risk coming into this year. So there's just some good rules of thumb there for growers about getting your stubble down. And you don't have to blanket burn. Windrow burning, you're removing a lot of residue, concentrating it and leaving much less on the bulk of the paddock. Grazing and other strategies can certainly do a good job at reducing that burden.
Yeah, and it's Ben Biddulph here. So, I mean, I guess, the main thing we're seeing with uptake of this message is, we've got around 40% of growers in WA who are already more proactively managing their stubble in frost-prone areas. So that's some of the survey data that's come back to the National Frost Initiative. So a lot of that is people integrating it with their harvest weed seed management and their stubble management. And in the higher rainfall zones, a lot of that is coming around how they manage the rotation. So essentially they're either windrow burning, cutting low, windrow burning, or chaff carting, or tram lighting and leaving the chaff in a dump in the middle every year. And then when they're coming into their barley rotation, most of those guys are on a canola, wheat, barley. When they're into the second year of their barley is when they're pulling in the matches and doing the blanket burn across the whole lot, because that's when they've actually got the maximum stubble build up. They're also running into these issues with their barley in terms of net blotch, and also they're having trouble actually just windrow burning their barley stubble because they've just got too much bulk there. And then when they go back to their more sensitive crops, their canola and their wheat, there's not much stubble there to start with after the canola. But when they go into their wheat, their wheat's relatively well protected from that, and they've got to manage their load. And that's helping them manage their risk of, wind erosion and soil erosion as well.
Thanks, Ben.
I'm going to jump straight into soil amelioration. There's a really big shift in WA, especially in the northern sand plain, to try and ameliorate for non-wetting sands. We're ameliorating to incorporate lime, fixed on-wetting, a whole range of issues. And there's been a bit of anecdotal evidence from growers that they're seeing where they've ameliorated, whether that's spaded or mouldboard, seems to be handling the frost a little better. So there's been a number of trials done to look at this, and people have started putting temperature monitoring equipment in and doing frost-induced sterility measurements and those sort of things to see what's going on. This first chart shows a range of trials, one that I was actually involved in Corrigin in 2014 and 15. and Brookton, 14 and 15. And in those years, they were quite mild, or virtually no frost in 2014 and mild frost in 15. But what we did pick up at the Brookton site was a drop-off. You can see the red line there, where it was ameliorated, which is a spading site, a drop in frost-induced sterility. These two trials in 2016 showed a real drop-off, so a lot less frost damage due to the soil amelioration. And how I believe that's working is when you have a non-wetting sand, it's a very poor conductor of heat. So a dry, sandy surface soil doesn't conduct much heat. For example, on a hot sunny day, if you're down at the beach and you're burning your feet, carrying all the stuff to the beach, if you wiggle your feet an inch under the ground, the soil is still cold and you don't burn your feet. And I believe that's what's going on with non-wetting sands, is that just the soil doesn't get an opportunity to accumulate any thermal mass. So these trials clearly show there's a yield response, and some of that is as a relation of reduction in frost-induced sterility. Another example of fixing a water repellent soil. The control in blue is a frost-induced sterility on the left, cultivated with offset discs or a spader, and we're seeing that spading, that full mixing of soil, fixing the non-wetting and also reducing the amount of frost-induced sterility. And the similar data again from claying. What we have found with these soil amelioration techniques is the plants we grow are very robust. They're healthier, they're better nourished, and they just seem more vigorous. So some of the differences is likely to be that potentially a drop in frost, like we're measuring with reduced frost-induced sterility. We're actually growing a very different, robust plant that may well be able to tolerate frost a little better as well. So it's going to need to be a bit more work over the next few years to tease out the key driver of it. But certainly for farmers who are investing in soil amelioration because they have a constraint, I think we'd look on frost tolerance as a result of that as being an added bonus. So you're going to do it anyway because you've got a subsoil acidity problem or a non-wetting sand problem. And as an added bonus, when there's a frost around, it's likely you'll pick up some additional tolerance. So that's how I'd be looking at it. I wouldn't be rushing out spading or mouldboard ploughing to manage frost. I'd be doing it because I have a problem, and picking up the frost tolerance on the way is a real bonus for growers. Here's some data just showing some differences, getting about half a degree difference between mouldboard and the control plots. This is one of the trial sites, getting very economic responses even in the absence of frost. 600 kilo yield response repeated in year 1 and year 2. So in this case, it's an economic viable strategy without frost, and if you pick up some frost tolerance on the way, and what we're definitely seeing is we're not seeing more frost risk. So it's good to know soil amelioration isn't adding to frost risk, but it may be reducing it. So in summary, you ameliorate for the problem. It's appearing very profitable on the right soil types, and there's likely to be a frost bonus, and we haven't had any indication that there's actually increasing frost risk, which is good to know. Row spacing, Peter, I thought since we're here for a Weed Smart Day, I thought you might have some comments on row spacing and weed competition. Don't know if you want to launch off with your thoughts or...
Well, I'd love to hear what you've got to say. I'm quickly trying to read what you've got there. So yeah, you go first, and I'll go.
The literature we'd read previously, some work done by Stephen Loss in the late 80s and Craig White in the early 2000s. They were picking up kind of 1 to 2 degrees warmer at head height by sowing on wide rows. So we thought that's a pretty easy thing to do. A few farmers have gone onto wide row lupins, so we pulled every second tine off some air seeders and did some research looking at widening rows. And what we found was every year we had 10 to 12, so this is double row spacing, so it was a 10-inch air seeder, we went to 20-inch. Often at this time there were a lot of 8-inch air seeders, 8-inch spacing, so we're going from 8 to 16 inches. We found we picked up that 10 to 12% yield loss in the presence and in the absence of frost. We couldn't get a temperature difference at head height, and we couldn't measure a difference in frost damage. I need to point out that all the sites we researched were white, sandy surface soils. From what we could find out, the work that had been done previously was on loams and darker coloured soils. where potentially you could retain a bit more heat with a darker coloured soil, but in a white sandy surface soil, sowing a wide row spacing, you're giving up yield potential, and we just weren't measuring any benefits for frost. So this chart is a bit of an example. We've got Yit-P on narrow rows. Going to wide rows has a drop-off in yield potential. Then we had a mix of a Yit-P and a wild catcham together, and again, narrow row, drop to wide row, drop in yield potential, and similarly wild catcham. These sites was in the presence of frost, and the wild catcham was significantly more frosted than the Yit-P was. But really, it's a very big opportunity cost for minimal benefit in as far as frost goes.
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting one, and part of what we're trying to do today is talk about where weed information and recommendations might be at odds with frost management, and row spacing is possibly one of those things. I don't know if Ben is still there, but he has commented that in their trials they haven't seen the difference in frost from wide and narrow rows, yet Garren, you said there was some older work that did. And also, I guess we've got to throw into their orientation, whether it's on north, south or east, west, because that could affect the soil surface temperature as well. I guess my point, and I'm a bit of a broken record with row spacing, but if you go to wide rows to manage frost, you're guaranteeing a yield loss every year because of the wide row spacing and the loss of yield there, whereas narrow row spacing, I don't know, is there sometimes when there is an extra yield loss from frost, but you only get that in the frosty years, of course. So yeah, I'd be interested, I don't know if Ben's still there, but interested if there is any other cases out there to find out where wide rows have definitely done better in frosty situations.
Yeah, well certainly from a frost point of view, our most frost-prone soils are the sandy surface soils, and they have a more limited ability to hold heat. So I'm very confident that going to wide rows on sandy surface soils as far as managing frost.
Yeah.
So I think we've been able to call that a myth busted, I think, Pete. Potentially on a really good dark loam, that would be different, but really they're not normally the high frost risk paddocks.
Yep.
I've got recently, I might just skip through to it on the lack of time. Blakely Painter has done some good research on barley and canopy and seed rate. And what he's been able to find, he went through a lot of his agronomy trials last year and found that in barley, increasing seed rate. So the first chart is a low frost affected site, with the black line being potential yield, blue being number of grains per head. And these two lines at the bottom is frost sterile, so effectively flower frost in barley, and then grain damage. And what he's found as he's increased plants per square metre, the yield has increased, the yield potential, but he's found that the frost effect hasn't changed. Similarly, where there's more frost damage, so he's got a moderately damaged site. Similarly, less grains per head, as you'd expect with more heads per square metre, increasing yield potential, but still no clear ramping up of either frost distorted grains or frost-induced sterility. So for barley growers, that's pretty good news, because we're often cautious for wheat about growing a really heavy canopy that covers the soil early and limits the amount of heat coming out. But certainly measured last year was in barley, growing a heavy canopy of barley isn't making any effect.
Yeah, well, that's good news. I mean, barley is a great competitor with weeds, and if teaming that up with a robust sowing rate is the way to get the most competition out of your barley. So if the data's showing it's not hurting us in terms of frost, that's good news. And
in the absence of frost, we're still picking up a yield increase. So I think that works really well.
Yeah.
And one of the things with barley, I'll show you this slide here, we're learning that barley is much more tolerant to frost at flowering, but can be more vulnerable during grain fill, or quite vulnerable during grain fill. So this slide shows where these are all frost damaged grains that will fail to form versus the healthier plumper grains. Another one that's recently been proven is potassium, Peter. A lot of WA light sandy surface soils are now very low in potassium, and we've been saying for a while that soils marginal in potash, or crops grown in deficient or marginal potash sites may be more vulnerable to frost, and research by Richard Bell from Murdoch Uni has been able to prove that. So, I think if we're trying to grow a competitive crop and choke out weeds, we want to make sure our crop nutrition's at its best, regardless of frost. But what we're seeing in some of this work is that if you're a bit marginal for potash, you could actually be making your crop more vulnerable. So I think there's a lot of upside there for growers. So this is a site here, topsoil 41 parts per million of potassium and a very depleted subsoil, where they've used 20, 40 to 80 kilos of potassium. They're seeing a drop-off in the amount of frost damage, and that's flowing through to yield. So I think it's really important. There's another trial that was undertaken at Lake Grace by CSVP, a site that received 80 of nitrogen, 8 of P and 0 of K with a deficient soil. Adding just 11 units of K reduced the frost sterility significantly, and a really big increase in yield response. And that part of that is a yield response due to nutrition, and the other part is significantly due to less frost. So I think that's another really good strategy for growers is what we've been finding. We've had a number of good potential years, and lots of farmers are only using NPK compounds to supply potash to their crops. And when you're only putting 8 to 12 units of K on, that just isn't enough potassium to replace removal. So what we're seeing is these subsoils have been heavily mined for potash. And even if you use a compound at seeding that puts you 10 or 12 units on, it's enough to set up a yield potential and compete with weeds early. But by September, when the canopy is at its largest, that's when the crops are running into potash deficiency, and that may well be adding to the frost sensitivity of that crop.
That's excellent data. I haven't seen that data, Garren, and I'd wondered, and I've been talking in the office with some other agronomists about this exact issue, and also with the moldboarding and spading responses. I'm wondering if potentially part of that is due to nutrition, and perhaps it could be something like K. And if we moldboard or spade a paddock, we don't increase the nutrient capacity, obviously, but perhaps by making it wettable, the crop can access the nutrients more so. So I know it's a very complex issue. There's all the thermodynamics of the moldboarded soil and so on, but I do really wonder whether something like crop nutrition does have an impact as well.
Yeah, I think if you look back at Liebberg's law of most limiting, if a crop's, and generally now we pump our crops with nitrogen, but if something else is limiting that crop, it's just not as robust. Less ability to compensate after an event, or maybe weaker. So there's a bit of indication that some trace elements may also have a role if you're deficient in copper and other things as well. And what we tend to find in WA is a lot of our nutrition is in the top 10 centimetres. And when we're heading into the frost period, often it's a dry spell, and that topsoil has been dry for a couple of weeks and the crop's been living on subsoil moisture. And that's where a lot of our micronutrients and macronutrients are, in that topsoil. So when we do a full soil mixing, we're really putting that nutrient right throughout the profile and making it available to the crop canopy at different times of the year.
Yeah. All right, well, we might need to wind up shortly, Garren, but I'll leave you for a couple of minutes to finish up with any summary slides that you have.
Yeah, I suppose I'll probably touch on other crops.
Yep.
In our environment in the southern areas, we find that oats are by far our most frost-tolerant crop, and we work quite hard to establish what the old oat grower strategy was, to sow oats last, because we've got very limited weed control options in oats. But what a lot of the growers are now doing is getting their oats in very early, often dry, or in April, sowing on the previous summer rain, getting the oats up and away, and we're finding we can really manage our weeds that way with a really heavy competitive canopy that chokes out the weeds. What we did learn last year is that oats aren't bulletproof. They're significantly more frost tolerant than any other cereal we grow, but we can still get grain damage in oats, and some growers had quality issues, lightweight oats, because so many of the growths were frosted and didn't form grain. So oats are significantly more frost tolerant than wheat or barley, but when we get really bad years with multiple events, they can still be damaged. But here's a trial here just showing frost-induced sterility. A wheat crop, 90, almost 100% wiped out. A barley around 40% touched up with frost, and an oat variety only 20% frosted. So while it's not bulletproof and can still be damaged by frost, compared to growing wheat on a frost-prone paddock, oats are by far a safer option. And from a weed point of view, a good early oat crop, we can sow oats because they're so tolerant to frost. We can sow oats early with confidence compared to a wheat variety, and then we get that really strong canopy to choke out the weeds. I just wanted to close on one last thing. We're going to see a yellow boom in Western Australia and maybe Australia-wide. With softening of cereal prices and with the summer rains we've had to date, it's going to give growers a lot of confidence to increase canola plantings. And what we found in the field last year was canola tended to tolerate frost quite well, and probably batting above its averages. Like normally we expect more frost damage than we actually received last year. And I just don't want growers to be led into a false sense of security because canola happened to tolerate frost well in 2016, that they should use canola as their frost tool right across the program. So I find that adjusting sowing date for canola is not easy, because as far as managing frost, I think you need to sow canola when the moisture's right and get it in as early as you can. But it's really all about frost management, and canola is really about paddock choice. And I'm just really worried that too many growers are going to plant a lot of canola low in the landscape on their frost-prone paddocks. And when it does get frosted, it can be very severe. So just a bit of a warning there for the advisors or any growers on the hookup today.
Righto. Thanks, Garren. Look, let's just summarise this whole thing. From what I've got from Ben, he's suggesting that early sowing's okay, but we want to have longer season varieties in the silo. That's good from a frost and a weeds perspective. We know our weeds, a lot of them are more dormant, are germinating later, and one of the management tactics is to sow early and sow a very competitive crop. So when the weeds do germinate, they germinate into a big competitive crop. So that is my summary point number one. Anything to add to that, Garren?
Probably the best wheat to sow. The best wheat to sow early is barley. If you have an early sowing opportunity, you don't have to make it wheat. In some parts of the state, that could be oats, or in other areas, barley. So we're regularly seeing a lot of blackleaf painters work. Early sowing barley will yield half a tonne to a tonne better than wheat at that same timing. So in our farming system, we have to capture those early sowing opportunities. But if it's going to be wheat, make it a long season. But in a lot of cases, growers will get a better result from a barley or an oat in that situation.
Excellent point. Thanks, Garren. There's a bit of my northern wheat belt bias there, but also from what we heard from Ben. But yes, so we've got other crops we can sow early, and if we do sow wheat early, some longer season varieties. In terms of crop competition, the summary is barley, robust seeding rates were fine. There are some question marks around row spacing. There's certainly lots of examples where narrow row spacing is okay, but there may be soils where wider row spacing is better for frost, which is at odds with the crop with weed competition. Any other points from you, Garren, on crop competition and frost versus weeds?
Yeah, I think the wide row spacing, you're giving up yield. When I work with my clients on strategies for frost, it's all about still maximising potential, and I think you're giving away too much to go wide rows to pick up there's not clear evidence that there's a benefit, and there's clear evidence that you're losing potential every year. So I think it's a very expensive strategy to adopt for minimal frost benefit.
Okay, excellent. And then the other things that you covered were soil amelioration. Things like mouldboard ploughs are good for weeds, good for frost. and nutrition like potassium. You've shown some data there showing that high potassium is good for frost. Obviously, good crop nutrition is good for crop competition with weeds. And so I guess these are other examples of where we're not at odds. We are in agreement, but we need to, I guess a lot of people that have been badly frosted are going to think frost first in 2017 at least, management, to make sure that they are not limited by frost. Is that a fair call, Garren, or is it, no, that was just one out of the box, we're back to business as usual? What's the feelings there?
I think you have to look at your history. You know, what we saw on that data that Ben put up was there was a fair bit of damage in the northern wheat belt that normally doesn't get frosted. So if you're someone in the northern central wheat belt, and they got 40% frosted last year, but have virtually had no frost damage the previous 10 years or the previous 5, then really there's probably not a lot of point to be gained in fully changing your strategy, because you may give up a lot of potential and miss out on your potential. But I've got clients now that have been frosted 3 out of the last 5 years, and they're going to be scratching their head and really thinking hard about what they do, their timing, mixing it up, giving up some potential on some paddocks to really lower their frost risk. So it's about managing your risks, but we don't want to see an overreaction to 2016, which is a rare event. But we've got to be mindful that how frequently you're getting frosted, and adopt some tools that suit your system if you're getting more than your share of frost.
Righto. Well, thanks, Garren, and thanks everyone for listening in. We've gone a few minutes over, and we haven't had questions come in other than questions that were from me. But thanks to Garren and Ben, between the two of you guys, there's a wealth of knowledge on frost. We don't have a perfect solution for frost. It's something that is going to be an ongoing area of research and experience. But really, I think compared to a few years ago, since I've been involved in listening to presentations about frost, the frost initiative and experience from agronomists and so on, we really have learned a lot, and we've come a long way. And while frost will always be a problem, we don't have a perfect answer, we have learned a lot, and there are lots of things that growers can do. So thanks to Ben, and thank you to you, Garren, for sharing your knowledge this morning.
Absolute pleasure, and let's hope for a warm spring this year.
Absolutely. All right, thanks everyone. We'll sign off from WeedSmart. That's it for our webinar series for this time of year. We'll be back in a couple of months with a couple more webinars. If you have a topic in mind and you'd like us to feature it, send us a message. But yeah, keep an eye out for other WeedSmart activities, and have a look at the WeedSmart website. Thanks, Garren, and thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone for listening in.
Thank you.